When I was just a little boy, I was obsessed with Disney. It was practically a part of every childhood, but for me, it was something unsettlingly immersive. I adored Mickey Mouse and, of course, the Lion King. Anything that was soaked in Disney magic. Mickey wasn't just a cartoon character for me. He was an idol. I'd watch him fumble around on screen, always getting into trouble he hadn't meant to cause, but somehow always managing to escape. My love for Mickey was so consuming that my parents joked the first words I ever spoke were Mickey Mouse. And one of the strangest, yet most memorable moments of my early years was the birthday party I had when I turned 6. Instead of the usual party hats, all the guests wore Mickey Mouse ears. To top it off, instead of hiring a clown or magician, my mom hired a man dressed as Mickey. It felt magical at the time, but now, looking back, it sends a chill down my spine. Every year after that, my parents kept feeding my obsession. A Mickey Mouse lunchbox one year, action figures of Mickey and his friends the next. Even a trip to Disney World. My shelves were overflowing with Mickey dolls, toys, and pictures, and I carried a plush Mickey with me everywhere I went. Then came my 9th birthday, and everything changed. Being born in the summer meant my birthday was always a pool party, where the heat didn't matter because the water cooled everyone down. My classmates didn't speak to me much during the year, but they always showed up for my birthday. That year, however, something felt off. A 5-year-old boy had gone missing that summer, and the tragedy caused a ripple effect. Suddenly, the other children's parents were on high alert, refusing to let their children out of sight. I thought my party would be empty, but my parents weren't having it. They doubled down on the theme, going overboard with Mickey. They didn't just get a Mickey cake. They bought 2 giant, 3-tiered cakes decorated with figurines of Mickey and his friends, like tiny versions of the Disney World parade. They even brought in horses, actors in full costumes, and security guards to ensure the safety of the children. But the most chilling part came when it was time to open presents. A huge box caught my attention at the start of the party, wrapped in silver paper with Mickey's face all over it. It was so big, it was almost ridiculous. The anticipation swelled, and I could hardly wait to see what lay inside. My parents handed me the box after I'd unwrapped everything else, and I tore into it with childish excitement. The box was marked refrigerator, but that didn't deter me. My parents always reused boxes, so it didn't seem odd. But when I finally ripped open the last of the wrapping, I froze. Inside the box, at first glance, it seemed like a giant hat. 2 round, velvety ears poked out, unmistakably Mickey's. I thought I was going to burst with excitement, but then my dad pulled out what I thought was the ultimate Mickey Mouse gift, a life-size Mickey doll. As soon as it was placed on the table, I felt an icy chill seep into my bones. My friends stared in awe, but I was no longer excited. The doll stood there, motionless, towering over me. Its black, hollow eyes stared blankly ahead, its smile stretching unnaturally wide. It wasn't the friendly, playful Mickey I'd known. This Mickey's smile didn't belong. It was too wide, too cold, too unnerving. I could hear my friends whispering, but all I could do was stare at the figure in front of me. Something about it felt wrong, deeply wrong. That Mickey, with its lifeless eyes and monstrous grin, became my worst nightmare. And from that day forward, my obsession with Mickey Mouse faded. Or perhaps it was replaced by something far darker. He was one of those dolls that could stand on its own, thanks to the stiff, pipe cleaner-like materials used in its giant, posable limbs. In hindsight, it should have been unsettling, but at the time, I was just a kid and I absolutely loved it. I couldn't believe how expensive it must have been, and I figured the reason I only got one gift that year was because my parents had both chipped in to buy me a real-life Mickey. From that day forward, my obsession with the doll grew. There was something almost magical about having a life-size version of my childhood idol Mickey. It was as though he really came to life. I would push him around the wooden floorboards, acting out my own little show, talking to him as if he would actually answer back. I stopped going outside and spent every free moment with him. Mickey became my protector, watching over me at night from the corner of my room. Finally, I was able to sleep without a nightlight, knowing Mickey would ward off any sinister creatures lurking in the dark. But that summer marked the end of my innocence. The last time I would ever look at Mickey with pure admiration. And that's when it began. The worst moments of my life, the ones that still haunt me to this day. It started with small things I could easily brush off. I'd be doing my homework and suddenly, I'd feel the prickling sensation of being watched. I'd turn, and there he'd be, Mickey, staring at me from the corner of the room, just as he always did when I didn't take him around the house. Sometimes I'd get so creeped out by his unnaturally wide eyes that I'd turn him away, facing the wall. I'd tell myself I just didn't want Mickey to guilt-trip me into playing instead of doing my homework. But it kept happening. Sometimes, I'd get up to grab a drink of water, and once again, I'd feel that eerie sensation of being watched. Turning my head, I'd catch Mickey staring right at me, his unblinking eyes fixed on my every move. It was unsettling to think that something like that could move on its own, but I'd always chalk it up to me brushing against him absent-mindedly, ignoring the fact that I'd taken the long way around the couch to avoid him. It only got worse at night, when the lights would flicker off and darkness swallowed me whole. That's when the nightmares began. I'd lie in bed, eyes wide open, unable to shake the feeling that someone was watching me. As the shadows took shape, I glanced towards the corner of my room where Mickey stood. But now his mouth seemed different. Huge, gaping, like the mouth of some monstrous creature. His smile, stretched across his pale face, seemed cavernous. I couldn't look at it for long. I would quickly turn away, pulling my covers over me as if they could protect me from whatever lurked in that room. The feeling grew worse with each passing night until one night I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a life-size Mickey doll and dragged it out of my room. I placed it by the door like a guard standing watch and whispered to it, "Please keep the monsters away from my room tonight." I shut the door behind me, feeling oddly relieved, as if the malice that had been creeping through the shadows had finally lifted. That night, I slept peacefully, without the sense of being followed, without the gnawing terror that something was waiting for me in the dark. For the first time in days, I woke up feeling rested. But when I opened my eyes the next morning, I froze. There, in the corner of my room, stood Mickey. He was staring right at me, his black eyes unblinking, that twisted grin still stretched across his face. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I thought maybe I just imagined it, that Mickey had somehow moved on his own during the night. But then the fog of sleep cleared and I realized it was far more likely that my mom had moved the doll after seeing it standing outside my door. I shrugged it off, a bit rattled but trying to calm myself. I greeted Mickey like I always did, but this time, something felt wrong. Like the air had grown thicker around him, like he was waiting for something. Something I couldn't see, something I couldn't understand. "Good morning, Mickey," I whispered, forcing a smile. "Thanks for keeping all the monsters away. You're the best." And it went on like this for days. Every night, I'd put Mickey outside to guard my door, and every morning, my mom would place him back inside my room. Still, Mickey never failed to surprise me. Each time I looked at him, those lifeless black eyes would be staring back, as if waiting for something or someone. The days grew colder as autumn settled in, and we had a large Thanksgiving gathering at the house. My cousins were just as mesmerized by Mickey as I had been when I first got him. They begged me to play with him, and I reluctantly agreed. They sat in front of him for hours, staring into his vacant face, even posing his arm as if he were offering a handshake. When I glanced at him, my stomach churned. Mickey's head was nearly decapitated, likely the result of a tug-of-war game. Furious, I took it upon myself to repair him, using glue and rough stitches. I pieced his head back on, but somehow, knowing Mickey was hurt made his vacant smile even more unnerving. I asked my mother, who was busy washing dishes, not to bring him into my room the next morning. I left him outside for a reason. She only nodded distracted, and I worried that she hadn't heard me. The next morning proved my fears right. When I woke up, I felt the familiar, sickening sensation of being watched. I turned, and there he was, Mickey, standing in the corner of my room, staring at me with those wide, dead eyes. His impossibly huge grin spread across his face. It was like a revelation. How unsettling Mickey had truly become. It was like those creepy stop-motion films I had loved as a child. But now I realized just how disturbing the clay faces really were. And it was happening to me in real life. As I stood there, frozen in place, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The dread that spread through me was unbearable. I stormed over to Mickey and grabbed him by his massive head, dragging him outside of my room. I shoved him into the storage room, face down on top of old suitcases, and slammed the door shut. I was done. I couldn't take it anymore. That morning, I confronted my mother. Why do you keep bringing Mickey back into my room every time I put him outside? I demanded. She looked at me confused as she set pancakes in front of me. What do you mean, dear? She asked, her brow raised in genuine concern. I felt a cold chill crawl down my spine. She had to be joking. Maybe my dad was the one bringing him in after I put him outside. He had a habit of staying up late to watch the news, so he must have been the one to put Mickey back in my room before bed. But then, the truth hit me like a bolt of lightning. My dad had gone to visit my grandmother at the hospital, planning to stay for a couple of days. He wasn't supposed to come home until the afternoon. A sickening realization dawned on me. There was no one else. I told myself I had to be imagining it, that it was just a recurring nightmare, a bad dream I had convinced myself was real, a feeble attempt to explain away what had been happening. That night, after my dad returned, my parents went to bed earlier than usual, and I was left with the crushing sense that someone was still in my room, watching, waiting. I stayed up late playing video games, trying to distract myself, but my thoughts kept returning to the large Mickey doll. I'd gotten so used to the smaller one, and I wondered what it was about the big one that unsettled me. Eventually, I turned off my light and crawled into bed, clutching one of my smaller dolls for comfort. I woke up in the middle of the night, the clock reading almost 3 a.m., my stomach twisted with unease. The first thing I did was glance at Mickey's usual spot in the corner. Relief washed over me when I saw he wasn't there. I tried to calm myself and fall back asleep, but then I heard it. A faint rustling, barely perceptible, just enough to make me question if it was real. A creak of floorboards from just outside my door made my heart stop. I froze, terror sweeping over me. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it was nothing, but I couldn't stop my heart from pounding, my palms from sweating. I felt like I was suffocating under my blanket, too afraid to even move. The fear paralyzed me, and I stayed like that until I finally fell asleep, not knowing how long it had been. The next morning, my mom woke me up, her voice angry. I was confused as she began scolding me for making a mess. She dragged me to the kitchen, showing me the cluttered pots and pans, as well as the shattered porcelain tea set she had received for Christmas. She assumed I had gotten up in the dark and caused a mess while trying to get a drink. I tried to explain that it wasn't me, that I hadn't even left my room, but she didn't believe a word of it. I was punished. My game console was confiscated, and I had to clean up the mess. I was too angry at my mother to even consider the possibility of what might have really happened that night. The day went on as usual, with me sulking in my room, bitter about the punishment. My mom spent the day cleaning the house and going out for groceries. I didn't realize I was alone until my father returned from work. For some reason, being alone in my room, even in the light of day, felt unsettling. That familiar feeling crept up again. I turned and looked at Mickey's corner, only to feel relief when I found it empty. But the unease didn't leave me. Even when I left my room and went into the living room to watch some TV, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Almost instinctively, I turned the channel to the Disney Channel. I don't even remember what show I was watching, but as I sat there, I couldn't help but feel guilty for what I had done. I'd thrown Mickey into the storage room without a second thought. I got up, feeling an urgent need to apologize to the doll, and practically ran to the storage closet. When I opened the door, I froze. There was Mickey, standing in front of the door as if he had been waiting for me to open it. A wave of dread washed over me, and I realized why I had shoved him in there in the first place. His smile had morphed into something far more sinister, a mean sneer that made my skin crawl. I couldn't see the cheerful face I once knew. All I could see was something hateful and twisted. I shut the door quickly, my heart racing. I returned to the living room, my mind reeling, but my mom called me back to the television. She was furious with me, and I was promptly sent to my room as punishment again. I was too angry to even come down for dinner that night. That night marked the beginning of something far worse. It was the night that changed everything. The reason I could never look at Disney's icon in the same way again. I could chalk it up to sleep paralysis, a vivid nightmare, or anything to explain it away, but in my heart, I knew what had happened. I lay in bed as usual, clutching a soft Mickey plush to my chest for comfort. But that night, it wasn't just the doll in my hands that made me feel safe. It was a haunting feeling that I wasn't truly alone. I lay in a fetal position, facing my door, trying to fall asleep again, but the same sickening feeling slowly crept over me. I woke up in the middle of the night, and this time, it was closer to 2 a.m. I froze beneath my covers, my eyes wide with fear, watching the door intently. My breath was hot against my hands, and then I heard it, the same creak as before. I thought it would stop, like the night before, but this time, it was worse. The door creaked open just a crack, and there, in the darkness, I saw the thing I dreaded, Mickey. I could make out the dark abyss of his eyes and the pale face, just staring at me. That twisted, sick smile spread across his face, and he stood there unmoving, just watching me shiver in terror. I didn't dare look away. We had a staring contest. He didn't move, and I struggled to keep my eyes open, fighting the heavy weight of sleep. But finally, I lost. Exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted off to sleep, my stomach still twisted with terror. The next morning, my father was furious. His paperwork had been scattered around the house, his reading glasses shattered, trampled on. My parents immediately blamed me, thinking I had taken out my anger on his important documents. I didn't even bother to mention the Mickey doll. They wouldn't have believed me, and it probably would have made them angrier. So, I just kept quiet, dreading the thought of being grounded again. Nightfall came all too quickly, and I was terrified to go to bed. I feared what would happen if I stayed awake and saw the doll move. With a heart full of dread, I crawled into bed, clutching a smaller doll for comfort, squeezing it tighter than usual. Surprisingly, I fell asleep fast. But once again, I woke up after 2 a.m., waiting for the inevitable creak of the floorboards, the opening of the door. My body froze in fear as it happened again. At this point, I wasn't sure if what happened next was real or just another nightmare. My door creaked open, revealing that pale face I had come to dread. And then, the unthinkable happened. The doll moved. It seemed to walk forward, pushing the doorknob with its hands to step inside. I whimpered, squeezing my eyes shut, hoping it was just a dream. But the movement of air in front of me, followed by a horrid stench, told me Mickey was right in front of me. Reluctantly, I cracked open my eyes. My breath caught in my throat. There it was, Mickey, standing before me, towering with his massive form. His waist was torn, crimson stains on the fabric, and the white buttons gleamed under the moonlight, almost like eyes. His face was twisted. The smile stretched wide, and his black, hollow eyes locked onto mine. I wanted to scream, but my body refused to move. It was as if I had been frozen in place. Mickey's head was lowered, his face staring directly at me, his grin wide and horrifying. I couldn't look away and I couldn't move until I passed out from sheer exhaustion. When I woke up the next morning, Mickey was gone. I ran to the storage closet, determined to destroy the doll once and for all. But when I threw open the door, I found nothing. Mickey was gone. There was no trace of him, and nothing else in the house had been disturbed that night. I was, at least, spared from being blamed for another mess. I thought it was finally over, but it wasn't. That day, my parents had a massive argument. I could hear their insults through the thin walls of my room. My mother cried herself to sleep, and my father left the house. I stayed in my room, feeling the weight of everything. But even though the doll had disappeared, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever presence had haunted me wasn't gone for good. I hugged my knees tightly under the covers, trembling in fear. A soft, almost mocking voice called out my name, and I froze in pure horror. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again. A slight rustle followed by the same haughty voice. "Johnny, why did you leave me?" I swore I saw a shadow rise up from the floor, with two unmistakable ears forming the shape of Mickey's iconic symbol. The shadow stretched against the bed sheets, and I didn't dare move. "You hurt my feelings, Johnny. You hurt me." The shadow grew larger as Mickey seemed to draw closer, and I could almost feel his presence right next to me. In sheer terror, I threw off the duvet and bolted for the door. Tears filled my eyes as I spun around, casting one last glance at Mickey's frozen body, still facing my bed. He didn't move, but the fear paralyzed me. I rushed into my parents' room, jumping into bed next to my mother. She sniffled softly, but didn't comfort me or chase me away. I spent the night there, in the safety of her presence, and for the first time in a long time, I managed to sleep without fear. When I woke up, my mother was gone, and no breakfast was waiting for me. The house felt empty. The doll was free again, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. As the day passed, I grew more fearful. My parents didn't return until the sky grew dark, and the house was quiet once again. When I heard my dad's car pull into the driveway, I felt a wave of relief. Both my parents came home, and my mother apologized, explaining she had gone to get my father. We had dinner together, but the tension in the air remained thick, and I couldn't relax. As bedtime approached, I dreaded going upstairs, away from the safety of my parents' presence. School would start again the next day, and I had to go to bed much earlier than I had gotten used to. I decided to stay awake the entire night, to keep Mickey at bay. But my resolve wasn't strong enough, and eventually I fell asleep. I woke with a start, knowing exactly what was coming. I waited for the telltale creak outside my door, the entrance of the monster. But that night was the worst by far. Instead of the usual creak, I heard rustling from somewhere in my room. My bed shifted ever so slightly, and I nearly threw up when I realized it was coming from under my bed. I closed my eyes, hoping to stave off the horror. Nothing else happened for a moment, and I opened my eyes with reluctant relief. Mickey wasn't standing right next to me, but my fear only grew when I saw a familiar shape at the foot of my bed. The stench of rot filled the air, permeating my senses. I knew that once I fell asleep, the horror would disappear, just like before, but it didn't occur to me that the doll was coming from beneath my bed. For days, the events repeated. I lost sleep, and I nodded off in class, which only made my mother more irritable. She demanded to know why I was so problematic, and I couldn't take it anymore. Finally, I told her about the doll, but she didn't believe me, going so far as to insist the doll didn't even exist. I argued with her the rest of the way home, and when we arrived, I retreated to my room, feeling like no one would ever understand. The horror of that night still lingers in my mind, and I can't help but wonder what truly happened. Why was it different that night? Maybe it was because I was fed up, angry, and had reached my breaking point. But whatever the reason, that night shattered everything. Instead of waking up to the oppressive darkness and fear that had become my nightly reality, I woke because of movement. Still half asleep, I didn't immediately realize what was happening. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then the sensation hit me. I had stuck my left foot out of the covers, and suddenly something velvety was pressed against it. Shock jolted through me as I sat up, my heart racing. Frozen in front of me was Mickey. His head had come loose from his body, and my foot was gently placed inside its open mouth. His body stood motionless at the foot of my bed, just like it always did. But now, it was positioned in such a way that it seemed ready to swallow my foothold, and the sight made my stomach churn with disgust. I couldn't take it any longer. I screamed for my parents, the fear taking over completely. I yanked my foot away from the doll's mouth and scrambled to the edge of my bed, tears streaking down my cheeks. Mickey's lifeless eyes, those dark, hollow sockets, seemed to follow me, and that twisted smile on his face grew wider. It was a final straw. Finally, the door to my room burst open. My parents rushed in, and my father turned on the light, flooding the room with brightness. My mother pulled me into her arms, whispering apologies as my father grabbed the doll's severed head and body, dragging it out of the room. He burned it in the yard, the stench of burning velvet filling the air. That was supposed to be the end of it. The entity that had claimed the doll as its vessel was gone, and I was told it would never follow me again. But the trauma from that night never left me. I left my house and went to live with my aunt until I was old enough to move out. My parents eventually split up. My father was arrested for drunk driving and later imprisoned for murder. My mother, devastated by everything that had happened, was found hanging in our childhood home, leaving behind a note that apologized profusely to me. The doll, its metallic eyes, and its sinister smile became haunting memories, forever connected to that once cheerful character. I never realized the true horror of what had happened until years later. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the doll's eyes were empty sockets, and something about them was unsettlingly hollow. What confuses me even more is that I can't decide if it was all just a figment of my imagination or if it was real. The thing that haunts me the most is how the doll could move when the body inside had been dead for months.